THE JUNGLE by Upton Sinclair. Chapter 26. After the elections, Jurgis stayed on in Packingtown and kept his job. The agitation to break up the police protection of criminals was continuing, and it seemed to him best to lay low for the present. He had nearly $300 in the bank, and might have considered himself entitled to a vacation. But he had an easy job, and force of habit kept him at it. Besides, Mike Scully, whom he consulted, advised him that something might turn up before long. Jurgis got himself a place in a boarding-house with some congenial friends. He had already inquired of Aniele and learned that Elzbieta and her family had gone downtown, and so he gave no further thought to them. He went with a new set now, young, unmarried fellows who were sporty. Jurgis had long ago cast off his fertilizer clothing, and since going into politics he had donned a linen collar and a greasy red necktie. He had some reason for thinking of his dress, for he was making about $11 a week, and 2/3 of it he might spend upon his pleasures without ever touching his savings. Sometimes he would ride downtown with a party of friends to the cheap theaters, and the music halls and other haunts with which they were familiar. Many of the saloons in Packingtown had pool tables, and some of them bowling alleys, by means of which he could spend his evenings in petty gambling. Also there were cards and dice. One time Jurgis got into a game on a Saturday night and won prodigiously, and because he was a man of spirit, he stayed in with the rest, and the game continued until late Sunday afternoon. And by that time he was out over $20. On Saturday nights, also, a number of balls were generally given in Packingtown. Each man would bring his girl with him, paying $50 for a ticket, and several dollars additional for drinks in the course of the festivities, which continued until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, unless broken up by fighting. During all this time the same man and woman would dance together, half stupefied with sensuality and drink. Before long Jurgis discovered what Scully had meant by something turning up. In May the agreement between the packers and the unions expired, and a new agreement had to be signed. Negotiations were going on, and the yards were full of talk of a strike. The old scale had dealt with the wages of the skilled men only, and of the members of the Meat Workers' Union about 2/3 were unskilled men. In Chicago these latter were receiving, for the most part, 18½ cents an hour, and the unions wished to make this the general wage for the next year. It was not nearly so large a wage as it seemed. In the course of the negotiations the union officers examined time checks to the amount of $10,000, and they found that the highest wages paid had been $14 a week, and the lowest $2.05, and the average of the whole $6.65. And $6.65 was hardly too much for a man to keep a family on, considering the fact that the price of dressed meat had increased nearly 50% in the last 5 years, while the price of beef on the hoof had decreased as much. It would have seemed that the packers ought to be able to pay it. But the packers were unwilling to pay it. They rejected the union demand, and to show what their purpose was, a week or two after the agreement expired, they put down the wages of about 1,000 men to 16½ cents, and it was said that Old Man Jones had vowed he would put them to 15 before he got through. There were 1.5 million of men in the country looking for work, 100,000 of them right in Chicago. And were the packers to let the union stewards march into their places and bind them to a contract that would lose them several $1,000s a day for a year? Not much. All this was in June, and before long the question was submitted to a referendum in the unions, and the decision was for a strike. It was the same in all the packing-house cities, and suddenly the newspapers and public woke up to face the gruesome spectacle of a meat famine. All sorts of pleas for a reconsideration were made, but the packers were obdurate, and all the while they were reducing wages and heading off shipments of cattle and rushing in wagon-loads of mattresses and cots. So the men boiled over, and one night telegrams went out from the Union headquarters to all the big packing centers, to St. Paul, South Omaha, Sioux City, St. Joseph's, Kansas City, East St. Louis, and New York. And the next day at noon, between 50 and 60,000 men drew off their working clothes and marched out of the factories, and the great beef strike was on. Jurgis went to his dinner, and afterward he walked over to see Mike Scully, who lived in a fine house, upon a street which had been decently paved and lighted for his especial benefit. Scully had gone into semi-retirement, and looked nervous and worried. "What do you want?" he demanded, when he saw Jurgis. "I came to see if maybe you could get me a place during the strike," the other replied. And Scully knit his brows and eyed him narrowly. In that morning's papers Jurgis had read a fierce denunciation of the packers by Scully, who had declared that if they did not treat their people better, the city authorities would end the matter by tearing down their plants. Now, therefore, Jurgis was not a little taken aback when the other demanded suddenly, "See here, Rudkus, why don't you stick by your job?" Jurgis started. "Work as a scab?" he cried. "Why not?" demanded Scully. "What's that to you?" But, stammered Jurgis. He had somehow taken it for granted that he should go out with his union. "The packers need good men, and need them bad," continued the other, "and they'll treat a man right that stands by them. Why don't you take your chance and fix yourself?" "But," said Jurgis, "how could I ever be of any use to you in politics?" "You can't be it anyhow," said Scully abruptly. "Why not?" asked Jurgis. "Hell, man!" cried the other. "Don't you know you're a Republican? And do you think I'm always going to elect Republicans? My brewer has found out already how we served him, and there is the deuce to pay." Jurgis looked dumbfounded. He had never thought of that aspect of it before. "I could be a Democrat," he said. "Yes," responded the other, "but not right away. A man can't change his politics every day. And besides, I don't need you. There'd be nothing for you to do. And it's a long time to election day, anyhow. And what are you going to do meantime?" "I thought I could count on you," began Jurgis. "Yes," responded Scully, "so you could. I never yet went back on a friend. But is it fair to leave the job I got you and come to me for another? I have had 100 fellows after me today, and what can I do? I've put 17 men on the city payroll to clean streets this 1 week, and do you think I can keep that up forever? It wouldn't do for me to tell other men what I tell you, but you've been on the inside, and you ought to have sense enough to see for yourself. What have you to gain by a strike?" "I hadn't thought," said Jurgis. "Exactly," said Scully, "but you'd better. Take my word for it, the strike will be over in a few days, and the men will be beaten. And meantime, what you can get out of it will belong to you. Do you see?" And Jurgis saw. He went back to the yards and into the workroom. The men had left a long line of hogs in various stages of preparation, and the foreman was directing the feeble efforts of a score or two of clerks and stenographers and office boys to finish up the job and get them into the chilling rooms. Jurgis went straight up to him and announced, "I have come back to work, Mr. Murphy." The boss's face lighted up. "Good man!" he cried. "Come ahead." "Just a moment," said Jurgis, checking his enthusiasm. "I think I ought to get a little more wages." "Yes," replied the other, "of course. What do you want?" Jurgis had debated on the way. His nerve almost failed him now, but he clenched his hands. "I think I ought to have $3 a day," he said. "All right," said the other promptly, and before the day was out our friend discovered that the clerks and stenographers and office boys were getting $5 a day, and then he could have kicked himself. So Jurgis became one of the new American heroes, a man whose virtues merited comparison with those of the martyrs of Lexington and Valley Forge. The resemblance was not complete, of course, for Jurgis was generously paid and comfortably clad, and was provided with a spring cot and a mattress and 3 substantial meals a day. Also, he was perfectly at ease, and safe from all peril of life and limb, save only in the case that a desire for beer should lead him to venture outside of the stockyards gates. And even in the exercise of this privilege he was not left unprotected. A good part of the inadequate police force of Chicago was suddenly diverted from its work of hunting criminals and rushed out to serve him. The police and the strikers also were determined that there should be no violence, but there was another party interested which was minded to the contrary, and that was the press. On the first day of his life as a strike-breaker, Jurgis quit work early, and in a spirit of bravado he challenged 3 men of his acquaintance to go outside and get a drink. They accepted, and went through the big Halsted Street gate, where several policemen were watching, and also some Union pickets, scanning sharply those who passed in and out. Jurgis and his companions went south on Halsted Street, past the hotel, and then suddenly half a dozen men started across the street toward them, and proceeded to argue with them concerning the error of their ways. As the arguments were not taken in the proper spirit, they went on to threats, and suddenly one of them jerked off the hat of one of the 4 and flung it over the fence. The man started after it, and then, as a cry of "Scab!" was raised, and a dozen people came running out of saloons and doorways, a second man's heart failed him, and he followed. Jurgis and the 4th stayed long enough to give themselves the satisfaction of a quick exchange of blows, and then they too took to their heels and fled back of the hotel and into the yards again. Meantime, of course, policemen were coming on a run, and as a crowd gathered, other police got excited and sent in a riot call. Jurgis knew nothing of this, but went back to Packers Avenue, and in front of the Central Time Station he saw one of his companions, breathless and wild with excitement, narrating to an ever-growing throng how the 4 had been attacked and surrounded by a howling mob, and had been nearly torn to pieces. While he stood listening, smiling cynically, several dapper young men stood by with notebooks in their hands, and it was not more than 2 hours later that Jurgis saw newsboys running about with armfuls of newspapers printed in red and black letters 6 inches high. "Violence in the yards. Strike-breakers surrounded by frenzied mob." If he had been able to buy all of the newspapers of the United States the next morning, he might have discovered that his beer-hunting exploit was being perused by some 20 millions of people, and had served as a text for editorials in half the staid and solemn business men's newspapers in the land. Jurgis was to see more of this as time passed. For the present, his work being over, he was free to ride into the city by a railroad direct from the yards, or else to spend the night in a room where cots had been laid in rows. He chose the latter, but to his regret, for all night long gangs of strike-breakers kept arriving. As very few of the better class of workingmen could be got for such work, these specimens of the new American hero contained an assortment of the criminals and thugs of the city, besides Negroes and the lowest foreigners, Greeks, Romanians, Sicilians, and Slovaks. They had been attracted more by the prospect of disorder than by the big wages, and they made the night hideous with singing and carousing, and only went to sleep when the time came for them to get up to work. In the morning, before Jurgis had finished his breakfast, Pat Murphy ordered him to one of the superintendents, who questioned him as to his experience in the work of the killing room. His heart began to thump with excitement, for he divined instantly that his hour had come, that he was to be a boss. Some of the foremen were union members, and many who were not had gone out with the men. It was in the killing department that the packers had been left most in the lurch, and precisely here that they could least afford it. The smoking and canning and salting of meat might wait, and all the by-products might be wasted. but fresh meats must be had, or the restaurants and hotels and brownstone houses would feel the pinch, and then public opinion would take a startling turn. An opportunity such as this would not come twice to a man, and Jurgis seized it. Yes, he knew the work, the whole of it, and he could teach it to others, but if he took the job and gave satisfaction, he would expect to keep it. They would not turn him off at the end of the strike? To which the superintendent replied that he might safely trust Durham's for that. They proposed to teach these unions a lesson, and most of all those foremen who had gone back on them. Jurgis would receive $5 a day during the strike, and $25 a week after it was settled. So our friend got a pair of slaughter-pen boots and jeans, and flung himself at the task. It was a weird sight, there on the killing beds. A throng of stupid black Negroes, and foreigners who could not understand a word that was said to them, mixed with pale-faced, hollow-chested bookkeepers and clerks, half fainting for the tropical heat and the sickening stench of fresh blood, and all struggling to dress a dozen or two cattle in the same place where, 24 hours ago, the old killing gang had been speeding, with their marvelous precision, turning out 400 carcasses every hour. The Negroes and the toughs from the levee did not want to work, and every few minutes some of them would feel obliged to retire and recuperate. In a couple of days Durham and Company had electric fans up to cool off the rooms for them, and even couches for them to rest on. And meantime they could go out and find a shady corner and take a snooze, and as there was no place for anyone in particular, and no system, it might be hours before their boss discovered them. As for the poor office employees, they did their best, moved to it by terror. 30 of them had been fired in a bunch that first morning for refusing to serve, besides a number of women clerks and typewriters who had declined to act as waitresses. It was such a force as this that Jurgis had to organize. He did his best, flying here and there, placing them in rows and showing them the tricks. He had never given an order in his life before, but he had taken enough of them to know, and he soon fell into the spirit of it, and roared and stormed like any old stager. He had not the most tractable pupils, however. "See hyar, boss," a big black buck would begin, "if you don't like de way I does dis job, you can get somebody else to do it." Then a crowd would gather and listen, muttering threats. After the first meal nearly all the steel knives had been missing, and now every Negro had one, ground to a fine point, hidden in his boots. There was no bringing order out of such a chaos, Jurgis soon discovered. And he fell in with the spirit of the thing. There was no reason why he should wear himself out with shouting. If hides and guts were slashed and rendered useless, there was no way of tracing it to anyone. And if a man lay off and forgot to come back, there was nothing to be gained by seeking him, for all the rest would quit in the meantime. Everything went during the strike, and the packers paid. Before long, Jurgis found that the custom of resting had suggested to some alert minds the possibility of registering at more than one place, and earning more than $5 a day. When he caught a man at this, he fired him, but it chanced to be in a quiet corner, and the man tendered him a $10 bill and a wink, and he took them. Of course, before long, this custom spread, and Jurgis was soon making quite a good income from it. In the face of handicaps such as these, the packers counted themselves lucky if they could kill off the cattle that had been crippled in transit, and the hogs that had developed disease. Frequently, in the course of a 2 or 3 days' trip, in hot weather and without water, some hog would develop cholera and die, and the rest would attack him before he had ceased kicking, and when the car was open there would be nothing of him left but the bones. If all the hogs in this carload were not killed at once, they would soon be down with the dread disease, and there would be nothing to do but make them into lard. It was the same with cattle that were gored and dying, or were limping with broken bones stuck through their flesh. They must be killed, even if brokers and buyers and superintendents had to take off their coats and help drive and cut and skin them. And meantime, agents of the packers were gathering gangs of Negroes in the country districts of the far South, promising them $5 a day and board, and being careful not to mention there was a strike. Already carloads of them were on the way, with special rates from the railroads, and all traffic ordered out of the way. Many towns and cities were taking advantage of the chance to clear out their jails and workhouses. In Detroit, the magistrates would release every man who agreed to leave town within 24 hours, and agents of the packers were in the courtrooms to ship them right. And meantime, trainloads of supplies were coming in for their accommodation, including beer and whiskey, so that they might not be tempted to go outside. They hired 30 young girls in Cincinnati to pack fruit, and when they arrived, put them at work canning corned beef, and put cots for them to sleep in a public hallway, through which the men passed. As the gangs came in day and night, under the escort of squads of police, they stowed away in unused workrooms and storerooms, and in the car sheds, crowded so closely together that the cots touched. In some places they would use the same room for eating and sleeping, and at night the men would put their cots upon the tables, to keep away from the swarms of rats. But with all their best efforts, the packers were demoralized. 90% of the men had walked out, and they faced the task of completely remaking their labor force. And with the price of meat up 30%, and the public clamoring for a settlement, they made an offer to submit the whole question at issue to arbitration. And at the end of 10 days the unions accepted it, and the strike was called off. It was agreed that all the men were to be reemployed within 45 days, and that there was to be no discrimination against union men. This was an anxious time for Jurgis. If the men were taken back without discrimination, he would lose his present place. He sought out the superintendent, who smiled grimly, and bade him wait and see. Durham's strikebreakers were few of them leaving. Whether or not the settlement was simply a trick of the packers to gain time, or whether they really expected to break the strike and cripple the unions by the plan, cannot be said. But that night there went out from the office of Durham and Company a telegram to all the big packing centers: "Employ no union leaders." And in the morning, when the 20,000 men thronged into the yards with their dinner pails and working clothes, Jurgis stood near the door of the hog trimming room, where he had worked before the strike, and saw a throng of eager men, with a score or two of policemen watching them. And he saw a superintendent come out and walk down the line, and pick out man after man that pleased him, and one after another came, and there were some men up near the head of the line who were never picked, they being the union stewards and delegates, and the men Jurgis had heard making speeches at the meetings. Each time, of course, there were louder murmurings and angrier looks. Over where the cattle butchers were waiting, Jurgis heard shouts and saw a crowd, and he hurried there. One big butcher, who was president of the Packing Trades Council, had been passed over 5 times, and the men were wild with rage. They had appointed a committee of 3 to go in and see the superintendent, and the committees had made 3 attempts, and each time the police had clubbed them back from the door. Then there were yells and hoots, continuing until at last the superintendent came to the door. "We all go back, or none of us do," cried 100 voices. And the other shook his fist at them and shouted, "You went out of here like cattle, and like cattle you'll come back." Then suddenly the big butcher president leaped upon a pile of stones and yelled, "It's off, boys! We'll all of us quit again!" And so the cattle butchers declared a new strike on the spot, and gathering their members from other plants, where the same trick had been played, they marched down Packers Avenue, which was thronged with a dense mass of workers, cheering wildly. Men who had already got to work on the killing beds dropped their tools and joined them. Some galloped here and there on horseback, shouting the tidings, and within half an hour the whole of Packingtown was on strike again, and beside itself with fury. There was quite a different tone in Packingtown after this. The place was a seething cauldron of passion, and the scab who ventured into it fared badly. There were one or two of these incidents each day, the newspapers detailing them, and always blaming them upon the unions. Yet 10 years before, when there were no unions in Packingtown, there was a strike and national troops had to be called, and there were pitched battles fought at night, by the light of blazing freight trains. Packingtown was always a center of violence. In Whiskey Point, where there were 100 saloons and one glue factory, there was always fighting, and always more of it in hot weather. Anyone who had taken the trouble to consult the station house blotter would have found that there was less violence that summer than ever before, and this while 20,000 men were out of work, and with nothing to do all day but brood upon bitter wrongs. There was no one to picture the battle the union leaders were fighting, to hold this huge army in rank, to keep it from straggling and pillaging, to cheer and encourage and guide 100,000 people, of a dozen different tongues, through 6 long weeks of hunger and disappointment and despair. Meantime, the packers had set themselves definitely to the task of making a new labor force. 1,000 or 2 of strike-breakers were brought in every night, and distributed among the various plants. Some of them were experienced workers, butchers, salesmen, and managers from the packers' branch stores, and a few union men who had deserted from other cities. But the vast majority were green Negroes from the cotton districts of the far South, and they were herded into the packing plants like sheep. There was a law forbidding the use of buildings as lodging houses unless they were licensed for the purpose, and provided with proper windows, stairways, and fire escapes. But here, in a paint room reached only by an enclosed chute, a room without a single window and only one door, 100 men were crowded upon mattresses on the floor. Up on the 3rd story of the hog house of Jones was a storeroom without a window, into which they crowded 700 men, sleeping upon the bare springs of cots, and with a second shift to use them by day. And when the clamor of the public led to an investigation into these conditions, and the mayor of the city was forced to order the enforcement of the law, the packers got a judge to issue an injunction forbidding him to do it. Just at this time the mayor was boasting that he had put an end to gambling and prize-fighting in the city. But here a swarm of professional gamblers had leagued themselves with the police to fleece the strike-breakers, and any night, in the big open space in front of Brown's, one might see brawny Negroes stripped to the waist and pounding each other for money, while a howling throng of 3,000 or 4,000 surged about, men and women, young white girls from the country rubbing elbows with big-buck Negroes with daggers in their boots, while rows of woolly heads peered down from every window of the surrounding factories. The ancestors of these black people had been savages in Africa, and since then they had been chattel slaves, or had been held down by a community ruled by the traditions of slavery. Now, for the first time, they were free to gratify every passion, free to wreck themselves. They were wanted to break a strike, and when it was broken, they would be shipped away, and their present masters would never see them again. And so whiskey and women were brought in by the carload and sold to them, and hell was let loose in the yards. Every night there were stabbings and shootings. It was said that the packers had blank permits, which enabled them to ship dead bodies from the city without troubling the authorities. They lodged men and women on the same floor, and with the night there began a saturnalia of debauchery, scenes such as never before had been witnessed in America. And as the women were the dregs from the brothels of Chicago, and the men were for the most part ignorant country Negroes, the nameless diseases of vice were soon rife, and this where food was being handled which was sent out to every corner of the civilized world. The Union stockyards were never a pleasant place, but now they were not only a collection of slaughterhouses, but also the camping place of an army of 15 or 20,000 human beasts. All day long the blazing midsummer sun beat down upon that square mile of abominations, upon tens of thousands of cattle crowded into pens, whose wooden floors stank and steamed contagion, upon bare, blistering, cinder-strewn railroad tracks, and huge blocks of dingy meat factories, whose labyrinthine passages defied a breath of fresh air to penetrate them. And there were not merely rivers of hot blood, and carloads of moist flesh, and rendering vats and soap cauldrons, glue factories and fertilizer tanks that smelt like the craters of hell. There were also tons of garbage festering in the sun, and the greasy laundry of the workers hung out to dry, and dining rooms littered with food and black with flies, and toilet rooms that were open sewers. And then at night, when this throng poured out into the streets to play, fighting, gambling, drinking and carousing, cursing and screaming, laughing and singing, playing banjos and dancing. They were worked in the yards all the 7 days of the week, and they had their prize fights and crap games on Sunday nights as well. But then around the corner one might see a bonfire blazing, and an old gray-headed negress, lean and witch-like, her hair flying wild and her eyes blazing, yelling and chanting of the fires of perdition and the blood of the Lamb, while men and women lay down upon the ground and moaned and screamed in convulsions of terror and remorse. Such were the stockyards during the strike, while the unions watched in sullen despair, and the country clamored like a greedy child for its food, and the packers went grimly on their way. Each day they added new workers, and could be more stern with the old ones, could put them on piecework, and dismiss them if they did not keep up the pace. Jurgis was now one of their agents in this process, and he could feel the change day by day, like the slow starting up of a huge machine. He had gotten used to being a master of men, and because of the stifling heat and the stench, and the fact that he was a scab and knew it and despised himself. He was drinking and developing a villainous temper, and he stormed and cursed and raged at his men, and drove them until they were ready to drop with exhaustion. Then one day late in August, a superintendent ran into the place and shouted to Jurgis and his gang to drop their work and come. They followed him outside to where, in the midst of a dense throng, they saw several two-horse trucks waiting, and 3 patrol wagon loads of police. Jurgis and his men sprang upon one of the trucks, and the driver yelled to the crowd, and they went thundering away at a gallop. Some steers had just escaped from the yards, and the strikers had got hold of them, and there would be the chance of a scrap. They went out at the Ashland Avenue gate, and over in the direction of the dump. There was a yell as soon as they were sighted, men and women rushing out of houses and saloons as they galloped by. There were 8 or 10 policemen on the truck, however, and there was no disturbance until they came to a place where the street was blocked with a dense throng. Those on the flying truck yelled a warning, and the crowd scattered pell-mell, disclosing one of the steers lying in its blood. There were a good many cattle butchers about just then, with nothing much to do, and hungry children at home, and so someone had knocked out the steer, and as a first-class man can kill and dress one in a couple of minutes, there were a good many steaks and roasts already missing. This called for punishment, of course, and the police proceeded to administer it by leaping from the truck and cracking at every head they saw. There were yells of rage and pain, and the terrified people fled into houses and stores, or scattered helter-skelter down the street. Jurgis and his gang joined in the sport, every man singling out his victim, and striving to bring him to bay and punch him. If he fled into a house, his pursuers would smash in the flimsy door and follow him up the stairs, hitting everyone who came within reach, and finally dragging his squealing quarry from under a bed or a pile of old clothes in a closet. Jurgis and 2 policemen chased some men into a bar-room. One of them took shelter behind the bar, where a policeman cornered him and proceeded to whack him over the back and shoulders until he lay down and gave a chance at his head. The others leaped a fence in the rear, balking the second policeman, who was fat, and as he came back, furious and cursing, a big Polish woman, the owner of the saloon, rushed in screaming, and received a poke in the stomach that doubled her up on the floor. Meantime, Jurgis, who was of a practical temper, was helping himself at the bar, and the first policeman, who had laid out his man, joined him, handing out several more bottles, and filling his pockets besides, and then, as he started to leave, cleaning off all the balance with a sweep of his club. The din of the glass crashing to the floor brought the fat Polish woman to her feet again, but another policeman came up behind her and put his knee into her back and his hands over her eyes, and then called to his companion, who went back and broke open the cash drawer and filled his pockets with the contents. Then the 3 went outside, and the man who was holding the woman gave her a shove and dashed out himself. The gang having already got the carcass onto the truck, the party set out at a trot, followed by screams and curses, and a shower of bricks and stones from unseen enemies. These bricks and stones would figure in the accounts of the riot, which would be sent out to a few thousand newspapers within an hour or 2, but the episode of the cash drawer would never be mentioned again, save only in the heartbreaking legends of Packingtown. It was late in the afternoon when they got back, and they dressed out the remainder of the steer, and a couple of others that had been killed, and then knocked off for the day. Jurgis went downtown to supper with 3 friends who had been on the other trucks, and they exchanged reminiscences on the way. Afterward they drifted into a roulette parlor, and Jurgis, who was never lucky at gambling, dropped about $15. To console himself he had to drink a good deal, and he went back to Packingtown about 2 in the morning, very much the worse for his excursion, and, it must be confessed, entirely deserving the calamity that was in store for him. As he was going to the place where he slept, he met a painted-cheeked woman in a greasy kimono, and she put her arm about his waist to steady him. They turned into a dark room they were passing. But scarcely had they taken 2 steps before suddenly a door swung open and a man entered, carrying a lantern. "Who's there?" he called sharply, and Jurgis started to mutter some reply. But at the same instant the man raised his light, which flashed in his face so that it was possible to recognize him. Jurgis stood stricken dumb, and his heart gave a leap like a mad thing. The man was Connor. Connor, the boss of the loading gang, the man who had seduced his wife, who had sent him to prison, and wrecked his home, ruined his life. He stood there, staring, with the light shining full upon him. Jurgis had often thought of Connor since coming back to Packingtown, but it had been as of something far off, that no longer concerned him. Now, however, when he saw him, alive and in the flesh, the same thing happened to him that had happened before. A flood of rage boiled up in him, a blind frenzy seized him, and he flung himself at the man and smote him between the eyes, and then as he fell, seized him by the throat and began to pound his head upon the stones. The woman began screaming, and people came rushing in. The lantern had been upset and extinguished, and it was so dark they could not see a thing, but they could hear Jurgis panting, and hear the thumping of his victim's skull, and they rushed there and tried to pull him off. Precisely as before, Jurgis came away with a piece of his enemy's flesh between his teeth, and, as before, he went on fighting with those who had interfered with him, until a policeman had come and beaten him into insensibility. and so Jurgis spent the balance of the night in the stockyards station house. This time, however, he had money in his pocket, and when he came to his senses he could get something to drink, and also a messenger to take word of his plight to Bush Harper. Harper did not appear, however, until after the prisoner, feeling very weak and ill, had been haled into court and remanded at $500 bail to await the result of his victim's injuries. Jurgis was wild about this, because a different magistrate had chanced to be on the bench, and he had stated that he had never been arrested before, and also that he had been attacked first, and if only someone had been there to speak a good word for him, he could have been let off at once. But Harper explained that he had been downtown, and had not got the message. "What's happened to you?" he asked. "I've been doing a fellow up," said Jurgis, "and I've got to get $500 bail." "I can arrange that all right," said the other, "though it may cost you a few dollars, of course. But what was the trouble?" "It was a man that did me a mean trick once," answered Jurgis. "Who is he?" "He's a foreman in Brown's, or used to be. His name's Connor." And the other gave a start. "Connor!" he cried. "Not Phil Connor?" "Yes," said Jurgis, "that's the fellow. Why?" "Good God!" exclaimed the other. "Then you're in for it, old man. I can't help you." "Not help me? Why not?" "Why, he's one of Scully's biggest men. He's a member of the War Whoop League, and they talked of sending him to the legislature. Phil Connor! Great heavens!" Jurgis sat dumb with dismay. "Why, he can send you to Joliet if he wants to," declared the other. "Can't I have Scully get me off before he finds out about it?" asked Jurgis at length. "But Scully's out of town," the other answered. "I don't even know where he is. He's run away to dodge the strike." That was a pretty mess indeed. Poor Jurgis sat half dazed. His pull had run up against a bigger pull, and he was down and out. "But what am I going to do?" he asked weakly. "How should I know?" said the other. "I shouldn't even dare to get bail for you. Why, I might ruin myself for life." Again there was silence. "Can't you do it for me?" Jurgis asked, "and pretend that you didn't know who'd I'd hit?" "But what good would that do you when you came to stand trial?" asked Harper. Then he sat buried in thought for a minute or two. "There's nothing. Unless it's this," he said. "I could have your bail reduced, and then if you had the money you could pay it and skip." "How much will it be?" Jurgis asked, after he had had this explained more in detail. "I don't know," said the other. "How much do you own?" "I've got about $300, was the answer. "Well," was Harper's reply, "I'm not sure, but I'll try and get you off for that. I'll take the risk for friendship's sake, for I'd hate to see you sent to state's prison for a year or two." And so finally Jurgis ripped out his bank book, which was sewed up in his trousers, and signed an order which Bush Harper wrote for all the money to be paid out. Then the latter went and got it, and hurried to the court, and explained to the magistrate that Jurgis was a decent fellow and a friend of Scully's, who had been attacked by a strike-breaker. So the bail was reduced to $300, and Harper went on it himself. He did not tell this to Jurgis, however, nor did he tell him that when the time for trial came, it would be an easy matter for him to avoid the forfeiting of the bail, and pocket the $300 as his reward for the risk of offending Mike Scully. All that he told Jurgis was that he was now free, and that the best thing he could do was to clear out as quickly as possible. And so Jurgis, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief, took the $1.14 that was left him out of all his bank account, and put it with the $2.25 that was left from last night's celebration, and boarded a streetcar and got off at the other end of Chicago. End of chapter 26. Recording The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Chapter 27. Poor Jurgis was now an outcast and a tramp once more. He was crippled, He was as literally crippled as any wild animal which has lost its claws, or been torn out of its shell. He had been shorn, at one cut, of all those mysterious weapons whereby he had been able to make a living easily and to escape the consequences of his actions. He could no longer command a job when he wanted it. He could no longer steal with impunity. He must take his chances with the common herd. Nay, worse, he dared not mingle with the herd. He must hide himself, for he was one marked out for destruction. His old companions would betray him for the sake of the influence they would gain thereby, and he would be made to suffer, not merely for the offense he had committed, but for others which would be laid at his door, just as had been done for some poor devil on the occasion of that assault upon the country customer by him and Duane. And also he labored under another handicap now. He had acquired new standards of living, which were not easily to be altered. When he had been out of work before, he had been content if he could sleep in a doorway or under a truck out of the rain, and if he could get 15 cents a day for saloon lunches. But now he desired all sorts of other things, and suffered because he had to do without them. He must have a drink now and then, a drink for its own sake, and apart from the food that came with it. The craving for it was strong enough to master every other consideration. He would have it, though it were his last nickel, and he had to starve the balance of the day in consequence. Jurgis became once more a besieger of factory gates, but never since he had been to Chicago had he stood less chance of getting a job than just then. For one thing, there was the economic crisis, the 1,000,000 or 2 of men who had been out of work in the spring and summer, and were not yet all back by any means. And then there was the strike, with 70,000 men and women all over the country idle for a couple of months, 20,000 in Chicago, and many of them now seeking work throughout the city. It did not remedy matters that a few days later the strike was given up and about half the strikers went back to work. For every one taken on, there was a scab who gave up and fled. The 10 or 15,000 green Negroes, foreigners, and criminals were now being turned loose to shift for themselves. Everywhere Jurgis went, he kept meeting them, and he was in an agony of fear lest some of them should know that he was wanted. He would have left Chicago, only by the time he had realized his danger he was almost penniless, and it would be better to go to jail than to be caught out in the country in the winter time. At the end of about 10 days Jurgis had only a few pennies left, and he had not yet found a job, not even a day's work at anything, not a chance to carry a satchel. Once again, as when he had come out of the hospital, he was bound hand and foot, and facing the grisly phantom of starvation. Raw, naked terror possessed him, a maddening passion that would never leave him, and that wore him down more quickly than the actual want of food. He was going to die of hunger. The fiend reached out its scaly arms for him, it touched him, its breath came into his face. And he would cry out for the awfulness of it. He would wake up in the night, shuddering and bathed in perspiration, and start up and flee. He would walk, begging for work, until he was exhausted. He could not remain still. He would wander on, gaunt and haggard, gazing about him with restless eyes. Everywhere he went, from one end of the vast city to the other, there were hundreds of others like him. Everywhere was the sight of plenty, and the merciless hand of authority waving them away. There is one kind of prison where the man is behind bars, and everything that he desires is outside. And there is another kind, where the things are behind the bars, and the man is outside. When he was down to his last quarter, Jurgis learned that before the bake shops closed at night, they sold out what was left at half price, and after that he would go and get 2 loaves of stale bread for a nickel, and break them up and stuff his pockets with them, munching a bit from time to time. He would not spend a penny save for this, and after 2 or 3 days more, he even became sparing of the bread, and would stop and peer into the ash barrels as he walked along the streets, and now and then rake out a bit of something, shake it free from dust, and count himself just so many minutes further from the end. So for several days he had been going about, ravenous all the time, and growing weaker and weaker, and then one morning he had a hideous experience that almost broke his heart. He was passing down a street lined with warehouses, and a boss offered him a job, and then, after he had started to work, turned him off because he was not strong enough. And he stood by and saw another man put into his place, and then picked up his coat and walked off, doing all that he could to keep from breaking down and crying like a baby. He was lost. He was doomed. There was no hope for him. But then, with a sudden rush, his fear gave place to rage. He fell to cursing. He would come back there after dark, and he would show that scoundrel whether he was good for anything or not. He was still muttering this when suddenly, at the corner, he came upon a green grocery, with a tray full of cabbages in front of it. Jurgis, after one swift glance about him, stooped and seized the biggest of them, and darted round the corner with it. There was a hue and cry, and a score of men and boys started in chase of him. But he came to an alley, and then to another branching off from it, and leading him into another street, where he fell into a walk and slipped his cabbage under his coat and went off unsuspected in the crowd. When he had gotten a safe distance away, he sat down and devoured half the cabbage raw, stowing the balance away in his pockets till the next day. Just about this time, one of the Chicago newspapers, which made much of the common people, opened a free soup kitchen for the benefit of the unemployed. Some people said that they did this for the sake of the advertising it gave them, and some others said that their motive was a fear lest all their readers should be starved off. But whatever the reason, the soup was thick and hot, and there was a bowl for every man all night long. When Jurgis heard of this from a fellow hobo, he vowed that he would have half a dozen bowls before morning. But as it proved, he was lucky to get one, for there was a line of men 2 blocks long before the stand, and there was just as long a line when the place was finally closed up. This depot was within the danger line for Jurgis, in the Levee district, where he was known. But he went there all the same, for he was desperate, and beginning to think of even the Bridewell as a place of refuge. So far the weather had been fair, and he had slept out every night in a vacant lot. But now there fell suddenly a shadow of the advancing winter, a chill wind from the north, and a driving storm of rain. That day Jurgis bought 2 drinks for the sake of the shelter, and at night he spent his last 2 pennies in a stale beer dive. This was a place kept by a Negro, who went out and drew off the old dregs of beer that lay in barrels set outside of the saloons, and after he had doctored it with chemicals to make it fizz, he sold it for 2 cents a can, the purchase of a can including the privilege of sleeping the night through upon the floor with a mass of degraded outcasts, men and women. All these horrors afflicted Jurgis all the more cruelly, because he was always contrasting them with the opportunities he had lost. For instance, just now it was election time again. Within 5 or 6 weeks the voters of the country would select a president, and he heard the wretches with whom he associated discussing it, and saw the streets of the city decorated with placards and banners. And what words could describe the pangs of grief and despair that shot through him? For instance, there was a night during this cold spell. He had begged all day for his very life, and found not a soul to heed him, until toward evening he saw an old lady getting off a streetcar and helped her down with her umbrellas and bundles, and then told her his hard luck story. And after answering all her suspicious questions satisfactorily, was taken to a restaurant and saw a quarter paid down for a meal. And so he had soup and bread, and boiled beef and potatoes and beans, and pie and coffee, and came out with his skin stuffed tight as a football. And then, through the rain and the darkness, far down the street, he saw red lights flaring, and heard the thumping of a bass drum. And his heart gave a leap, and he made for the place on the run, knowing without the asking that it meant a political meeting. The campaign had so far been characterized by what the newspapers termed apathy. For some reason, the people refused to get excited over the struggle, and it was almost impossible to get them to come to meetings, or to make any noise when they did come. Those which had been held in Chicago so far had proved most dismal failures, and tonight, the speaker being no less a personage than a candidate for the vice-presidency of the nation, the political managers had been trembling with anxiety. But a merciful Providence had sent this storm of cold rain, and now all it was necessary to do was to set off a few fireworks and thump a while on a drum, and all the homeless wretches from a mile around would pour in and fill the hall. And then on the morrow the newspapers would have a chance to report the tremendous ovation, and to add that it had been no silk-stocking audience either, proving clearly that the high tariff sentiments of the distinguished candidate were pleasing to the wage-earners of the nation. So Jurgis found himself in a large hall, elaborately decorated with flags and bunting, and after the chairman had made his little speech, and the orator of the evening rose up, amid an uproar from the band, only fancy the emotions of Jurgis upon making the discovery that the personage was none other than the famous and eloquent Senator Spareshanks, who had addressed the Doyle Republican Association at the stockyards, and helped to elect Mike Scully's tenpin setter to the Chicago Board of Aldermen. In truth, the sight of the senator almost brought tears into Jurgis' eyes. What agony it was to him to look back upon those golden hours, when he too had a place beneath the shadow of the plum tree, when he too had been of the elect through whom the country is governed, when he had had a bung in the campaign barrel for his own. And this was another election in which the Republicans had all the money, and but for that one hideous accident he might have had a share of it, instead of being where he was. The eloquent senator was explaining the system of protection, an ingenious device whereby the working man permitted the manufacturer to charge him higher prices, in order that he might perceive higher wages, thus taking his money out of his pocket with one hand and putting a part of it back with the other. To the senator this unique arrangement had somehow become identified with the higher verities of the universe. It was because of it that Columbia was the gem of the ocean, and all her future triumphs, her power and her good repute among the nations, depended upon the zeal and fidelity with which each citizen held up the hands of those who were toiling to maintain it. The name of this heroic company was the Grand Old Party. And here the band began to play, and Jurgis sat up with a violent start. Singular as it may seem, Jurgis was making a desperate effort to understand what the senator was saying, to comprehend the extent of American prosperity, the enormous expansion of American commerce, and the Republic's future in the Pacific and in South America, and wherever else the oppressed were groaning. The reason for it was that he wanted to keep awake. He knew that if he allowed himself to fall asleep, he would begin to snore loudly, and so he must listen, he must be interested. But he had eaten such a big dinner, and he was so exhausted, and the hall was so warm, and his seat was so comfortable. The senator's gaunt form began to grow dim and hazy, to tower before him and dance about, with figures of exports and imports. Once his neighbor gave him a savage poke in the ribs, and he sat up with a start and tried to look innocent. But then he was at it again, and men began to stare at him with annoyance, and to call out in vexation. Finally one of them called a policeman, who came and grabbed Jurgis by the collar and jerked him to his feet, bewildered and terrified. Some of the audience turned to see the commotion, and Senator Spareshanks faltered in his speech. But a voice shouted cheerily, "We're just firing a bum. Go ahead, old sport!" And so the crowd roared, and the senator smiled genially, and went on. And in a few seconds poor Jurgis found himself landed out in the rain, with a kick and a string of curses. He got into the shelter of a doorway and took stock of himself. He was not hurt, and he was not arrested, more than he had any right to expect. He swore at himself and his luck for a while, and then turned his thoughts to practical matters. He had no money and no place to sleep. He must begin begging again. He went out, hunching his shoulders together and shivering at the touch of the icy rain. Coming down the street toward him was a lady, well dressed and protected by an umbrella, and he turned and walked beside her. "Please, ma'am," he began, "could you lend me the price of a night's lodging? I'm a poor working man." Then suddenly he stopped short. By the light of a street lamp he had caught sight of the lady's face. He knew her. It was Elena Jasaityte, who had been the belle of his wedding feast. Elena Jasaityte, who had looked so beautiful and danced with such a queenly air with Juozas Raczius, the teamster. Jurgis had only seen her once or twice afterward, for Juozas had thrown her over for another girl, and Elena had gone away from Packingtown, no one knew where. And now he met her here. She was as much surprised as he was. "Jurgis Rudkus," she gasped. "And what in the world is the matter with you?" I've had hard luck," he stammered. "I'm out of work, and I've no home and no money." "And you, Elena, are you married?" "No," she answered, "I'm not married, but I've got a good place." They stood staring at each other for a few moments longer, and finally Elena spoke again. "Jurgis," she said, "I'd help you if I could, upon my word I would. But it happens that I've come out without my purse, and I honestly haven't a penny with me. I can do something far better for you, though. I can tell you how to get help. I can tell you where Marija is." Jurgis gave a start. "Marija?" he exclaimed. "Yes," said Elena, "and she'll help you. She's got a place, and she's doing well. She'll be glad to see you." It was not much more than a year since Jurgis had left Packingtown, feeling like one escaped from jail, and it had been from Marija and Elzbieta that he was escaping. But now, at the mere mention of them, his whole being cried out with joy. He wanted to see them. He wanted to go home. They would help him, they would be kind to him. In a flash he had thought over the situation. He had a good excuse for running away, his grief at the death of his son. And also he had a good excuse for not returning, the fact that they had left Packingtown. "All right," he said, "I'll go." So she gave him a number on Clark Street, adding, "There's no need to give you my address, because Marija knows it." And Jurgis set out without further ado. He found a large brownstone house of aristocratic appearance, and rang the basement bell. A young colored girl came to the door, opening it about an inch, and gazing at him suspiciously. "What do you want?" she demanded. "Does Marija Berczynskas live here?" he inquired. "I don't know," said the girl. "What you want with her?" "I want to see her," said he. "She's a relative of mine." The girl hesitated a moment. Then she opened the door and said, "Come in." Jurgis came and stood in the hall, and she continued, "I'll go see. What's your name?" "Tell her it's Jurgis," he answered, and the girl went upstairs. She came back at the end of a minute or two and replied, "Dey ain't no sich person here." Jurgis' heart went down into his boots. "I was told this was where she lived," he cried. But the girl only shook her head. "De lady says dey ain't no sich person here," she said. And he stood for a moment, hesitating, helpless with dismay. Then he turned to go to the door. At the same instant, however, there came a knock upon it, and the girl went to open it. Jurgis heard the shuffling of feet, and then heard her give a cry, and the next moment she sprang back and past him, her eyes shining white with terror, and bounded up the stairway, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Police! Police! We're pinched!" Jurgis stood for a second, bewildered. Then, seeing blue-coated forms rushing upon him, he sprang after the negress. Her cries had been the signal for a wild uproar above. The house was full of people, and as he entered the hallway he saw them rushing hither and thither, and crying and screaming with alarm. There were men and women, the latter clad for the most part in wrappers, the former in all stages of dishabille. At one side Jurgis caught a glance of a big apartment with plush-covered chairs, and tables covered with trays and glasses. There were playing cards scattered all over the floor. One of the tables had been upset, and bottles of wine were rolling about, their contents running out upon the carpet. There was a young girl who had fainted, and two men who were supporting her, and there were a dozen others crowding toward the front door. Suddenly, however, there came a series of resounding blows upon it, causing the crowd to give back. At the same instant a stout woman, with painted cheeks and diamonds in her ears, came running down the stairs, panting breathlessly. "To the rear! Quick!" She led the way to a back staircase, Jurgis following. In the kitchen she pressed a spring, and a cupboard gave way and opened, disclosing a dark passage. "Go in!" she cried to the crowd, which now amounted to 20 or 30, and they began to pass through. Scarcely had the last one disappeared, however, before there were cries from in front, and then the panic-stricken throng poured out again, exclaiming, "They're there too! We're trapped!" "Upstairs!" cried the woman, and there was another rush of the mob, women and men cursing and screaming and fighting to be first. One flight, two, three, and then there was a ladder to the roof, with a crowd packed at the foot of it, and one man at the top, straining and struggling to lift the trap-door. It was not to be stirred, however, and when the woman shouted up to unhook it, he answered, "It's already unhooked. There's somebody sitting on it." And a moment later came a voice from downstairs, "You might as well quit, you people. We mean business this time." So the crowd subsided, and a few moments later several policemen came up, staring here and there, and leering at their victims. Of the latter the men were for the most part frightened and sheepish-looking. The women took it as a joke, as if they were used to it, though if they had been pale one could not have told, for the paint on their cheeks. One black-eyed young girl perched herself upon the top of the balustrade and began to kick with her slippered foot at the helmets of the policemen, until one of them caught her by the ankle and pulled her down. On the floor below 4 or 5 other girls sat upon trunks in the hall, making fun of the procession which filed by them. They were noisy and hilarious, and had evidently been drinking. One of them, who wore a bright red kimono, shouted and screamed in a voice that drowned out all the other sounds in the hall, and Jurgis took a glance at her, and then gave a start and a cry. "Marija!" She heard him and glanced around. Then she shrank back and half sprang to her feet in amazement. "Jurgis!" she gasped. For a second or two they stood staring at each other. "How did you come to be here?" Marija exclaimed. "I came to see you," he answered. "When?" "Just now." "But how did you know? Who told you I was here?" "Elena Jasaityte. I met her on the street." Again there was a silence, while they gazed at each other. The rest of the crowd was watching them, and so Marija got up and came closer to him. "And you?" Jurgis asked. "You live here?" "Yes," said Marija, "I live here." Then suddenly came a hail from below. "Get your clothes on now, girls, and come along. You'd best begin, or you'll be sorry. It's raining outside." "Brrr!" shivered someone, and the women got up and entered the various doors which lined the hallway. "Come," said Marija, and took Jurgis into her room, which was a tiny place about 8 by 6, with a cot and a chair and a dressing-stand and some dresses hanging behind the door. There were clothes scattered about on the floor, and hopeless confusion everywhere. Boxes of rouge and bottles of perfume mixed with hats and soiled dishes on the dresser, and a pair of slippers and a clock, and a whiskey bottle on a chair. Marija had nothing on but a kimono and a pair of stockings, yet she proceeded to dress before Jurgis, and without even taking the trouble to close the door. He had by this time divined what sort of place he was in, and he had seen a great deal of the world since he had left home, and was not easy to shock, and yet it gave him a painful start that Marija should do this. They had always been decent people at home, and it seemed to him that the memory of old times ought to have ruled her. But then he laughed at himself for a fool. What was he to be pretending to decency? "How long have you been living here?" he asked. "Nearly a year," she answered. "Why did you come?" "I had to live," she said, "and I couldn't see the children starve." He paused for a moment, watching her. "You were out of work?" he asked finally. "I got sick," she replied, "and after that I had no money. And then Stanislovas died." "Stanislovas dead?" "Yes," said Marija. "I forgot. You didn't know about that." "How did he die?" "Rats killed him," she answered. Jurgis gave a gasp. "Rats killed him?" "Yes," said the other. She was bending over, lacing her shoes as she spoke. "He was working in an oil factory—at least, he was hired by the men to get their beer. He used to carry cans on a long pole, and he'd drink a little out of each can. And one day he drank too much, and fell asleep in a corner, and got locked up in the place all night. When they found him, the rats had killed him and eaten him nearly all up." Jurgis sat, frozen with horror. Marija went on, lacing up her shoes. There was a long silence. Suddenly a big policeman came to the door. "Hurry up there," he said. "As quick as I can," said Marija, and she stood up and began putting on her corsets with feverish haste. "Are the rest of the people alive?" asked Jurgis finally. "Yes," she said. "Where are they?" "They live not far from here. They're all right now." "They are working?" he inquired. "Elzbieta is," said Marija, "when she can. I take care of them most of the time. I'm making plenty of money now." Jurgis was silent for a moment. "Do they know you live here—how you live?" he asked. "Elzbieta knows," answered Marija. "I couldn't lie to her. And maybe the children have found out by this time. It's nothing to be ashamed of; we can't help it." "And Tamoszius?" he asked. "Does he know?" Marija shrugged her shoulders. "How do I know?" she said. "I haven't seen him for over a year. He got blood poisoning and lost one finger, and couldn't play the violin any more. And then he went away." Marija was standing in front of the glass, fastening her dress. Jurgis sat staring at her. He could hardly believe that she was the same woman he had known in the old days. She was so quiet, so hard. It struck fear to his heart to watch her. Then suddenly she gave a glance at him. "You look as if you had been having a rough time of it yourself," she said. "I have," he answered. "I haven't a cent in my pockets, and nothing to do." "Where have you been?" "All over. I've been hoboing it. Then I went back to the yards just before the strike." He paused for a moment, hesitating. "I asked for you," he added. "I found you had gone away, no one knew where. Perhaps you think I did you a dirty trick, running away as I did, Marija." "No," she answered. "I don't blame you. We never have, any of us. You did your best. The job was too much for us." She paused for a moment, then added, "We were too ignorant. That was the trouble. We didn't stand any chance. If I'd known what I know now, we'd have won out." "You'd have come here?" said Jurgis. "Yes," she answered. "But that's not what I meant. I meant how differently you would have behaved—about Ona." Jurgis was silent. He had never thought of that aspect of it. "When people are starving," the other continued, "and they have anything with a price, they ought to sell it, I say. I guess you realize it now, when it's too late. Ona could have taken care of us all, in the beginning." Marija spoke without emotion, as one who had come to regard things from the business point of view. Yes, I guess so," Jurgis answered hesitatingly. He did not add that he had paid $300 and a foreman's job for the satisfaction of knocking down Phil Connor a second time. The policeman came to the door again just then. "Come on now," he said. "Lively." "All right," said Marija, reaching for her hat, which was big enough to be a drum major's, and full of ostrich feathers. She went out into the hall, and Jurgis followed, the policeman remaining to look under the bed and behind the door. "What's going to come of this?" Jurgis asked, as they started down the steps. "The raid, you mean? Oh, nothing. It happens to us every now and then. The madam's having some sort of time with the police. I don't know what it is, but maybe they'll come to terms before morning. Anyhow, they won't do anything to you. They always let the men off." "Maybe so," he responded, "but not me. I'm afraid I'm in for it." "How do you mean?" "I'm wanted by the police," he said, lowering his voice, though of course their conversation was in Lithuanian. "They'll send me up for a year or two, I'm afraid." "Hell!" said Marija. "That's too bad. I'll see if I can't get you off." Downstairs, where the greater part of the prisoners were now massed, she sought out the stout personage with the diamond earrings, and had a few whispered words with her. The latter then approached the police sergeant who was in charge of the raid. "Billy," she said, pointing to Jurgis, "there's a fellow who came in to see his sister. He's just got in the door when you knocked. You aren't taking hoboes, are you?" The sergeant laughed as he looked at Jurgis. "Sorry," he said, "but the orders are everyone but the servants." So Jurgis slunk in among the rest of the men, who kept dodging behind each other like sheep that have smelled a wolf. There were old men and young men, college boys and graybeards old enough to be their grandfathers. Some of them wore evening dresses. There was no one among them save Jurgis who showed any signs of poverty. When the roundup was completed, the doors were opened and the party marched out. 3 patrol wagons were drawn up at the curb, and the whole neighborhood had turned out to see the sport. There was much chaffing and a universal craning of necks. The women stared about them with defiant eyes, or laughed and joked, while the men kept their heads bowed and their hats pulled over their faces. They were crowded into the patrol wagons as if into streetcars, and then off they went amid a din of cheers. At the station house Jurgis gave a Polish name, and was put into a cell with half a dozen others; and while these sat and talked in whispers, he lay down in a corner and gave himself up to his thoughts. Jurgis had looked into the deepest reaches of the social pit, and grown used to the sights in them. Yet when he had thought of all humanity as vile and hideous, he had somehow always accepted his own family that he had loved, and now this sudden horrible discovery—Marija, a whore, and Elzbieta and the children living off her shame. Jurgis might argue with himself all he chose, that he had done worse, and was a fool for caring, but still he could not get over the shock of that sudden unveiling. He could not help being sunk in grief because of it. The depths of him were troubled and shaken. Memories were stirred in him that had been sleeping so long he had counted them dead. Memories of the old life, his old hopes and his old yearnings, his old dreams of decency and independence. He saw Ona again, he heard her gentle voice pleading with him. He saw little Antanas, whom he had meant to make a man. He saw his trembling old father, who had blessed them all with his wonderful love. He lived again through that day of horror when he discovered Ona's shame. God, how he had suffered! What a madman he had been! How dreadful it had all seemed to him! And now today he had sat and listened, and half agreed when Marija told him he had been a fool. Yes, told him that he ought to have sold his wife's honor and lived by it. And then there was Stanislovas and his awful fate, that brief story which Marija had narrated so calmly, and with such dull indifference. The poor little fellow, with his frostbitten fingers and his terror of the snow, his wailing voice rang in Jurgis' ears as he lay there in the darkness, until the sweat started on his forehead. Now and then he would quiver with a sudden spasm of horror at the picture of little Stanislovas shut up in the deserted building and fighting for his life with the rats. All these emotions had become strangers to the soul of Jurgis. It was so long since they had troubled him that he had ceased to think they might ever trouble him again. Helpless, trapped as he was, what good did they do him? Why should he ever have allowed them to torment him? It had been the task of his recent life to fight them down, to crush them out of him. Never in his life would he have suffered from them again, save that they had caught him unawares and overwhelmed him before he could protect himself. He heard the old voices of his soul, and he saw its old ghosts beckoning to him, stretching out their arms to him. But they were far off and shadowy, and the gulf between them was black and bottomless. They would fade away into the mists of the past once more. Their voices would die, and never again would he hear them. And so the last faint spark of manhood in his soul would flicker out. End of chapter 27. Recording. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Chapter 28. After breakfast, Jurgis was driven to the court, which was crowded with the prisoners and those who had come out of curiosity or in the hope of recognizing one of the men and getting a case for blackmail. The men were called first, and reprimanded in a bunch, and then dismissed. But Jurgis, to his terror, was called separately, as being a suspicious-looking case. It was in this very same court that he had been tried, that time when his sentence had been suspended. It was the same judge and the same clerk. The latter now stared at Jurgis, as if he half thought that he knew him, but the judge had no suspicions. Just then his thoughts were upon a telephone message he was expecting from a friend of the police captain of the district, telling what disposition he should make of the case of Polly Simpson, as the madam of the house was known. Meantime he listened to the story of how Jurgis had been looking for his sister, and advised him dryly to keep his sister in a better place. Then he let him go, and proceeded to fine each of the girls $5, which fines were paid in a bunch from a wad of bills which Madame Polly extracted from her stocking. Jurgis waited outside and walked home with Marija. The police had left the house, and already there were a few visitors. By evening the place would be running again, exactly as if nothing had happened. Meantime Marija took Jurgis upstairs to her room, and they sat and talked. By daylight Jurgis was able to observe that the color of her cheeks was not the old natural one of abounding health. Her complexion was in reality a parchment yellow, and there were black rings under her eyes. "Have you been sick?" he asked. "Sick," she said. "Hell!" Marija had learned to scatter her conversation with as many oaths as a longshoreman or a mule driver. "How can I ever be anything but sick at this life?" She fell silent for a moment, staring ahead of her gloomily. "It's morphine," she said at last. "I seem to take more of it every day." "What's that for?" he asked. "It's the way of it. I don't know why. If it isn't that, it's drink. If the girls didn't booze, they couldn't stand it any time at all. And the madam always gives them dope when they first come, and they learn to like it. Or else they take it for headaches and such things, and get the habit that way. I've got it, I know. I've tried to quit, but I never will while I'm here." "How long are you going to stay?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "Always, I guess. What else could I do?" "Don't you save any money?" "Save!" said Marija. "Good Lord, no! I get enough, I suppose, but it all goes. I get a half share, $2.50 for each customer, and sometimes I make $25 or $30 a night, and you'd think I ought to save something out of that. But then I am charged for my room and my meals, and such prices as you never heard of, and then for extras and drinks, for everything I get, and some I don't. My laundry bill is nearly $20 each week alone. Think of that! Yet, what can I do? I either have to stand it or quit, and it would be the same anywhere else. It's all I can do to save the $15 I give Elzbieta each week, so the children can go to school." Marija sat brooding in silence for a while. Then, seeing that Jurgis was interested, she went on. "That's the way they keep the girls. They let them run up debts so they can't get away. A young girl comes from abroad, and she doesn't know a word of English, and she gets into a place like this, and when she wants to go, the madam shows her that she is a couple of $100 in debt, and takes all her clothes away, and threatens to have her arrested if she doesn't stay and do as she's told. So she stays, and the longer she stays, the more in debt she gets. Often, too, they are girls that didn't know what they were coming to, that had hired out for housework. Did you notice that little French girl with the yellow hair that stood next to me in the court?" Jurgis answered in the affirmative. "Well, she came to America about a year ago. She was a store clerk, and she hired herself to a man to be sent here to work in a factory. There were 6 of them altogether, and they were brought to a house just down the street from here. And this girl was put into a room alone, and they gave her some dope in her food, and when she came to, she found that she had been ruined. She cried and screamed and tore her hair, but she had nothing but a wrapper, and couldn't get away, and they kept her half insensible with drugs all the time, until she gave up. She never got outside of that place for 10 months, and then they sent her away because she didn't suit. I guess they'll put her out of here, too. She's getting to have crazy fits from drinking absinthe. Only one of the girls that came out with her got away, and she jumped out of a second-story window one night. There was a great fuss about that. Maybe you heard of it." "I did," said Jurgis. "I heard of it afterward. It had happened in the place where he and Duane had taken refuge from their country customer. The girl had become insane, fortunately for the police." "There's lots of money in it," said Marija. "They get as much as $40 a head for the girls, and they bring them from all over. There are 17 in this place, and 9 different countries among them. In some places you might find even more. We have half a dozen French girls. I suppose it's because the madam speaks the language. French girls are bad, too, the worst of all, except for the Japanese. There's a place next door that's full of Japanese women, but I wouldn't live in the same house with one of them." Marija paused for a moment or two, and then she added, "Most of the women here are pretty decent. You'd be surprised. I used to think they did it because they liked to. But fancy a woman selling herself to every kind of man that comes, old or young, black or white, and doing it because she likes to." "Some of them say they do," said Jurgis. "I know," said she. "They say anything. They're in, and they know they can't get out. But they didn't like it when they began. You'd find out. It's always misery. There's a little Jewish girl here, who used to run errands for a milliner, and got sick and lost her place. And she was 4 days on the streets without a mouthful of food, and then she went to a place just around the corner and offered herself, and they made her give up her clothes before they would give her a bite to eat." Marija sat for a minute or two, brooding somberly. "Tell me about yourself, Jurgis," she said suddenly. "Where have you been?" So he told her the long story of his adventures since his flight from home; his life as a tramp, and his work in the freight tunnels, and the accident, and then of Jack Duane and of his political career in the stockyards, and his downfall and subsequent failures. Marija listened with sympathy. It was easy to believe the tale of his late starvation, for his face showed it all. "You found me just in the nick of time," she said. "I'll stand by you. I'll help you till you can get some work." "I don't like to let you," he began. "Why not? Because I'm here?" "No, not that," he said. "But I went off and left you." "Nonsense!" said Marija. "Don't think about it. I don't blame you." "You must be hungry," she said, after a minute or two. "You stay here to lunch. I'll have something up in the room." She pressed a button, and a colored woman came to the door and took her order. "It's nice to have somebody to wait on you," she observed with a laugh, as she lay back on the bed. As the prison breakfast had not been liberal, Jurgis had a good appetite, and they had a little feast together, talking meanwhile of Elzbieta and the children and old times. Shortly before they were through there came another colored girl with the message that the madam wanted Maria—Lithuanian Mary, as they called her here. "That means you have to go," she said to Jurgis. So he got up, and she gave him the address of the family, a tenement over in the Ghetto district. "You go there," she said. "They'll be glad to see you." But Jurgis stood hesitating. I don't like to," he said. "Honest, Marija, why don't you just give me a little money, and let me look for work first?" "How do you need money?" was her reply. "All you want is something to eat and a place to sleep, isn't it?" "Yes," he said. "But then I don't like to go there after I left them, and while I have nothing to do, and while you—" "Go on," said Marija, giving him a push. "What are you talking? I won't give you money," she added, as she followed him to the door, "because you'll drink it up and do yourself harm. Here's a quarter for you now, and go along, and they'll be so glad to have you back you won't have time to feel ashamed. Good-bye." So Jurgis went out and walked down the street to think it over. He decided that he would first try to get work, and so he put in the rest of the day wandering here and there among factories and warehouses without success. Then, when it was nearly dark, he concluded to go home and set out. But he came to a restaurant, and went in and spent his quarter for a meal, and when he came out he changed his mind. The night was pleasant, and he would sleep somewhere outside and put in the morrow hunting, and so have one more chance of a job. So he started away again, when suddenly he chanced to look about him, and found that he was walking down the same street and past the same hall where he had listened to the political speech the night before. There was no red fire and no band now, but there was a sign out announcing a meeting, and a stream of people pouring in through the entrance. In a flash Jurgis had decided that he would chance it once more, and sit down and rest while making up his mind what to do. There was no one taking tickets, so it must be a free show again. He entered. There were no decorations in the hall this time, but there was quite a crowd upon the platform, and almost every seat in the place was filled. He took one of the last, far in the rear, and straightway forgot all about his surroundings. Would Elzbieta think that he had come to sponge off her, or would she understand that he meant to get work again and do his share? Would she be decent to him, or would she scold him? If only he could get some sort of job before he went! If that last boss had only been willing to try him! Then suddenly Jurgis looked up. A tremendous roar had burst from the throats of the crowd, which by this time had packed the hall to the very doors. Men and women were standing up, waving handkerchiefs, shouting, yelling. Evidently the speaker had arrived, thought Jurgis. What fools they were making of themselves! What were they expecting to get out of it anyhow? What had they to do with elections, with governing the country? Jurgis had been behind the scenes in politics. He went back to his thoughts, but with one further fact to reckon with, that he was caught here. The hall was now filled to the doors, and after the meeting it would be too late for him to go home, so he would have to make the best of it outside. Perhaps it would be better to go home in the morning anyway, for the children would be at school, and he and Elzbieta could have a quiet explanation. She always had been a reasonable person, and he really did mean to do right. He would manage to persuade her of it, and besides, Marija was willing, and Marija was furnishing the money. If Elzbieta were ugly, he would tell her that in so many words. So Jurgis went on meditating, until finally, when he had been an hour or two in the hall, there began to prepare itself a repetition of the dismal catastrophe of the night before. Speaking had been going on all the time, and the audience was clapping its hands and shouting, thrilling with excitement. And little by little the sounds were beginning to blur in Jurgis' ears, and his thoughts were beginning to run together, and his head to wobble and nod. He caught himself many times as usual, and made desperate resolutions, but the hall was hot and close, and his long walk and his dinner were too much for him. In the end his head sank forward, and he went off again. And then again someone nudged him, and he sat up with his old terrified start. He had been snoring again, of course. And now what? He fixed his eyes ahead of him with painful intensity, staring at the platform as if nothing else ever had interested him, or ever could interest him, all his life. He imagined the angry exclamations, the hostile glances. He imagined the policeman striding toward him, reaching for his neck. Or was he to have one more chance? Were they going to let him alone this time? He sat trembling, waiting. And then suddenly came a voice in his ear, a woman's voice, gentle and sweet. "If you would try to listen, comrade, perhaps you would be interested." Jurgis was more startled by that than he would have been by the touch of a policeman. He still kept his eyes fixed ahead, and did not stir. But his heart gave a great leap. Comrade! Who was it that called him comrade? He waited long, and at last, when he was sure that he was no longer watched, he stole a glance out of the corner of his eyes at the woman who sat beside him. She was young and beautiful, she wore fine clothes, and was what is called a lady, and she called him comrade. He turned a little carefully, so that he could see her better. Then he began to watch her, fascinated. She had apparently forgotten all about him, and was looking toward the platform. A man was speaking there. Jurgis heard his voice vaguely, but all his thoughts were for this woman's face. A feeling of alarm stole over him as he stared at her. It made his flesh creep. What was the matter with her? What could be going on to affect anyone like that? She sat as one turned to stone, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, so tightly that he could see the cords standing out in her wrists. There was a look of excitement upon her face, of tense effort, as of one struggling mightily or witnessing a struggle. There was a faint quivering of her nostrils, and now and then she would moisten her lips with feverish haste. Her bosom rose and fell as she breathed, and her excitement seemed to mount higher and higher, and then to sink away, like a boat tossing upon ocean surges. What was it? What was the matter? It must be something that the man was saying, up there on the platform. What sort of a man was he? And what sort of thing was this anyhow? So all at once it occurred to Jurgis to look at the speaker. It was like coming suddenly upon some wild sight of nature, a mountain forest lashed by a tempest, a ship tossed about upon a stormy sea. Jurgis had an unpleasant sensation, a sense of confusion, of disorder, of wild and meaningless uproar. The man was tall and gaunt, as haggard as his auditor himself. A thin black beard covered half of his face, and one could see only two black hollows where the eyes were. He was speaking rapidly, in great excitement. He used many gestures. He spoke as he moved here and there upon the stage, reaching with his long arms as if to seize each person in his audience. His voice was deep, like an organ, It was some time, however, before Jurgis thought of the voice. He was too much occupied with his eyes to think of what the man was saying. But suddenly it seemed as if the speaker had begun pointing straight at him, as if he had singled him out particularly for his remarks. And so Jurgis became suddenly aware of his voice, trembling, vibrant with emotion, with pain and longing, with a burden of things unutterable, not to be compassed by words. To hear it was to be suddenly arrested, to be gripped, transfixed. "You listen to these things," the man was saying, "and you say, 'Yes, they are true, but they have been that way always.' Or you say, 'Maybe it will come, but not in my time. It will not help me.' And so you return to your daily round of toil. You go back to be ground up for profits in the world-wide mill of economic might, to toil long hours for another's advantage, to live in mean and squalid homes, to work in dangerous and unhealthful places, to wrestle with the specters of hunger and privation, to take your chances of accident, disease, and death. And each day the struggle becomes fiercer, the pace more cruel. Each day you have to toil a little harder, and feel the iron hand of circumstances close upon you a little tighter. Months pass, years maybe, and then you come again. And again I am here to plead with you, to know if want and misery have yet done their work with you, if injustice and oppression have yet opened your eyes. I shall still be waiting. There is nothing else that I can do. There is no wilderness where I can hide from these things. There is no haven where I can escape them. Though I travel to the ends of the earth, I find the same accursed system. I find that all the fair and noble impulses of humanity, the dreams of poets and the agonies of martyrs, are shackled and bound in the service of organized and predatory greed. And therefore I cannot rest. I cannot be silent. Therefore I cast aside comfort and happiness, health and good repute, and go out into the world and cry out the pain of my spirit. Therefore I am not to be silenced by poverty and sickness, not by hatred and obloquy, by threats and ridicule, not by prison and persecution, if they should come, not by any power that is upon the earth or above the earth, that was or is or ever can be created. If I fail tonight, I can only try tomorrow, knowing that the fault must be mine, that if once the vision of my soul were spoken upon earth, if once the anguish of its defeat were uttered in human speech, it would break the stoutest barriers of prejudice, it would shake the most sluggish soul to action. It would abash the most cynical, it would terrify the most selfish. And the voice of mockery would be silenced, and fraud and falsehood would slink back into their dens, and the truth would stand forth alone. For I speak with the voice of the millions who are voiceless, of them that are oppressed and have no comforter, of the disinherited of life for whom there is no respite and no deliverance, to whom the world is a prison, a dungeon of torture, a tomb; with the voice of the little child who toils tonight in the southern cotton mill, staggering with exhaustion, numb with agony, and knowing no hope but the grave; of the mother who sews by candlelight in her tenement garret, weary and weeping, smitten with the mortal hunger of her babes; of the man who lies upon a bed of rags, wrestling in his last sickness and leaving his loved ones to perish; of the young girl who somewhere at this moment is walking the streets of this horrible city, beaten and starving, and making her choice between the brothel and the lake; with the voice of those, whoever and wherever they may be, who are caught beneath the wheels of the juggernaut of greed; with the voice of humanity calling for deliverance, of the everlasting soul of man arising from the dust, breaking its way out of its prison, rending the bands of oppression and ignorance, groping its way to the light. The speaker paused. There was an instant of silence, while men caught their breaths, and then, like a single sound, there came a cry from 1,000 people. Through it all Jurgis sat still, motionless and rigid, his eyes fixed upon the speaker. He was trembling, smitten with wonder. Suddenly the man raised his hands, and silence fell, and he began again. "I plead with you," he said, "whoever you may be, provided that you care about the truth. But most of all, I plead with working-man, with those to whom the evils I portray are not mere matters of sentiment, to be dallied and toyed with, and then perhaps put aside and forgotten, to whom they are the grim and relentless realities of the daily grind, the chains upon their limbs, the lash upon their backs, the iron in their souls. To you, working-men! To you, the toilers, who have made this land and have no voice in its councils! To you, whose lot it is to sow that others may reap, to labor and obey and ask no more than the wages of a beast of burden, the food and shelter to keep you alive from day to day. It is to you that I come with my message of salvation. It is to you that I appeal. I know how much it is to ask of you. I know, for I have been in your place. I have lived your life, and there is no man before me here tonight who knows it better. I have known what it is to be a street waif, a bootblack, living upon a crust of bread, and sleeping in cellar stairways and under empty wagons. I have known what it is to dare and to aspire, to dream mighty dreams and to see them perish, to see all the fair flowers of my spirit trampled into the mire by the wild beast powers of my life. I know what is the price that a working man pays for knowledge. I have paid for it with food and sleep, with agony of body and mind, with health, almost with life itself. And so, when I come to you with a story of hope and freedom, with the vision of a new earth to be created, of a new labor to be dared, I am not surprised that I find you sordid and material, sluggish and incredulous. That I do not despair is because I know also the forces that are driving behind you, because I know the raging lash of poverty, the sting of contempt and mastership, the insolence of office and the spurns, because I feel sure that in the crowd that has come to me tonight, no matter how many may be dull and heedless, no matter how many may have come out of idle curiosity, or in order to ridicule, there will be some one man whom pain and suffering have made desperate, whom some chance vision of wrong and horror has startled and shocked into attention. And to him my words will come like a sudden flash of lightning to one who travels in darkness, revealing the way before him, the perils and the obstacles, solving all problems, making all difficulties clear. The scales will fall from his eyes, the shackles will be torn from his limbs. He will leap up with a cry of thankfulness. He will stride forth a free man at last. A man delivered from his self-created slavery. A man who will never more be trapped, whom no blandishments will cajole, whom no threats will frighten, who from tonight on will move forward and not backward, who will study and understand, who will gird on his sword and take his place in the army of his comrades and brothers, who will carry the good tidings to others as I have carried them to him, priceless gift of liberty and light that is neither mine nor his, but is the heritage of the soul of man. Working-men, working-men, comrades, open your eyes and look about you. You have lived so long in the toil and heat that your senses are dulled, your souls are numbed. But realize once in your lives this world in which you dwell. Tear off the rags of its customs and conventions, behold it as it is, in all its hideous nakedness. Realize it, realize it! Realize that out upon the plains of Manchuria tonight two hostile armies are facing each other. That now, while we are seated here, 1,000,000 human beings may be hurled at each other's throats, striving with the fury of maniacs to tear each other to pieces. And this in the 20th century, 1900 years since the Prince of Peace was born on earth. 1900 years that his words have been preached as divine. And here, Two armies of men are rending and tearing each other like the wild beasts of the forest. Philosophers have reasoned, prophets have denounced, poets have wept and pleaded, and still this hideous monster roams at large. We have schools and colleges, newspapers and books. We have searched the heavens and the earth, we have weighed and probed and reasoned, and all to equip men to destroy each other. We call it war, and pass it by. But do not put me off with platitudes and conventions. Come with me, realize it. See the bodies of men pierced by bullets, blown into pieces by bursting shells. Hear the crunching of the bayonet plunged into human flesh. Hear the groans and shrieks of agony. See the faces of men crazed by pain, turned into fiends by fury and hate. Put your hand upon that piece of flesh. It is hot and quivering. Just now it was a part of a man. This blood is still steaming. It was driven by a human heart. Almighty God, and this goes on. It is systematic, organized, premeditated. And we know it, and read of it, and take it for granted. Our papers tell of it, and the presses are not stopped. Our churches know of it, and do not close their doors. The people behold it, and do not rise up in horror and revolution. Or perhaps Manchuria is too far away from you. Come home with me, then. Come here to Chicago. Here in this city tonight 10,000 women are shut up in foul pens, and driven by hunger to sell their bodies to live. And we know it, we make it a jest. And these women are made in the image of your mothers. They may be your sisters, your daughters. The child whom you left at home tonight, whose laughing eyes will greet you in the morning. That fate may be waiting for her. Tonight in Chicago there are 10,000 men, homeless and wretched, willing to work and begging for a chance, yet starving and fronting in terror the awful winter cold. Tonight in Chicago there are 100,000 children wearing out their strength and blasting their lives in the effort to earn their bread. There are 100,000 mothers who are living in misery and squalor, struggling to earn enough money to feed their little ones. There are 100,000 old people, cast off and helpless, waiting for death to take them from their torments. There are 1,000,000 people, men, women, and children, who share the curse of the wage slave, who toil every hour they can stand and see, for just enough to keep them alive, who are condemned till the end of their days to monotony and weariness, to hunger and misery, to heat and cold, to dirt and disease, to ignorance and drunkenness and vice. And then turn over the page with me, and gaze upon the other side of the picture. There are 1,000, 10,000 maybe, who are the masters of these slaves, who own their toil. They do nothing to earn what they receive. They do not even have to ask for it. It comes to them of itself. Their only care is to dispose of it. They live in palaces, they riot in luxury and extravagance, such as no words can describe, as makes the imagination reel and stagger, makes the soul grow sick and faint. They spend hundreds of dollars for a pair of shoes, a handkerchief, a garter. They spend millions for horses and automobiles and yachts, for palaces and banquets, for little shiny stones with which to deck their bodies. Their life is a contest among themselves for supremacy in ostentation and recklessness, in the destroying of useful and necessary things, in the wasting of the labor and the lives of their fellow creatures, the toil and anguish of the nations, the sweat and tears and blood of the human race. It is all theirs. It comes to them, just as all the springs pour into streamlets, and the streamlets into rivers, and the rivers into the oceans. So, automatically and inevitably, all the wealth of society comes to them. The farmer tills the soil, the miner digs in the earth, the weaver tends the loom, the mason carves the stone. The clever man invents, the shrewd man directs, the wise man studies, the inspired man sings. And all the result, the products of the labor of brain and muscle, are gathered into one stupendous stream and poured into their laps. The whole of society is in their grip, the whole labor of the whole world lies at their mercy, and like fierce wolves they rend and destroy, like ravening vultures they devour and tear. The whole power of mankind belongs to them, forever and beyond recall. Do what it can, strive as it will, humanity lives for them and dies for them. They own not merely the labor of society, they have bought the governments, and everywhere they use their raped and stolen power to entrench themselves in their privileges, to dig wider and deeper the channels through which the river of profits flows to them. And you, working men, you have been brought up to it. You plod on like beasts of burden, thinking only of the day and its pain. Yet is there a man among you who can believe that such a system will continue forever? Is there a man here in this audience tonight so hardened and so debased that he dare rise up before me and say that he believes that it can continue forever? That the product of the labor of society, the means of existence of the human race, will always belong to idlers and parasites, to be spent for the gratification of vanity and lust, to be spent for any purpose whatever, to be at the disposal of any individual will whatever? That somehow, somewhere, the labor of humanity will not belong to humanity, to be used for the purposes of humanity, to be controlled by the will of humanity. And if this is ever to be, how is it to be? What power is there that will bring it about? Will it be the task of your masters, do you think? Will they write the charter of your liberties? Will they forge you the sword of your deliverance? Will they marshal you the army and lead it to the fray? Will their wealth be spent for the purpose? Will they build colleges and churches to teach you? Will they print papers to herald your progress, and organize political parties to guide and carry on the struggle? Can you not see that the task is your task, yours to dream, yours to resolve, yours to execute? That if ever it is carried out, it will be in the face of every obstacle that wealth and mastership can oppose, in the face of ridicule and slander, of hatred and persecution, of the bludgeon and the jail, that it will be by the power of your naked bosoms opposed to the rage of oppression, by the grim and bitter teaching of blind and merciless affliction, by the painful gropings of the untutored mind, by the feeble stammering of the uncultured voice, by the sad and lonely hunger of the spirit, by seeking and striving and yearning, by heartache and despairing, by agony and sweat of blood. It will be by money paid for with hunger, by knowledge stolen from sleep, by thoughts communicated under the shadow of the gallows. It will be a movement beginning in the far-off past, a thing obscure and unhonored, a thing easy to ridicule, easy to despise, a thing unlovely, wearing the aspect of vengeance and hate. But to you, the working man, the wage slave, calling with a voice insistent, imperious, with a voice that you cannot escape, wherever upon the earth you may be, with the voice of all your wrongs, with the voice of all your desires, with the voice of your duty and your hope, of everything in the world that is worth while to you, the voice of the poor demanding that poverty shall cease, the voice of the oppressed pronouncing the doom of oppression, the voice of power brought out of suffering, of resolution crushed out of weakness, of joy and courage born in the bottomless pit of anguish and despair, the voice of labor, despised and outraged, a mighty giant lying prostrate, mountainous, colossal, but blinded, bound, and ignorant of his strength. And now a dream of resistance haunts him, hope battling with fear, until suddenly he stirs, and a fetter snaps, and a thrill shoots through him to the farthest ends of his huge body, and in a flash the dream becomes an act. He starts, he lifts himself up, and the bands are shattered, the burdens roll off him. He rises, towering, gigantic, he springs to his feet, he shouts in his new-born exultation. And the speaker's voice broke suddenly. with the stress of his feelings. He stood with his arms stretched out above him, and the power of his vision seemed to lift him from the floor. The audience came to its feet with a yell. Men waved their arms, laughing aloud in their excitement, and Jurgis was with them. He was shouting to tear his throat, shouting because he could not help it, because the stress of his feeling was more than he could bear. It was not merely the man's words, the torrent of his eloquence; it was his presence, it was his voice, a voice with strange intonations that rang through the chambers of the soul like the clanging of a bell, that gripped the listener like a mighty hand about his body, that shook him and startled him with sudden fright, with a sense of things not of earth, of mysteries never spoken before, of presences of awe and terror. There was an unfolding of vistas before him, a breaking of the ground beneath him, an upheaving, a stirring, a trembling. He felt himself suddenly a mere man no longer. There were powers within him undreamed of, there were demon forces contending, age-long wonders struggling to be born. And he sat oppressed with pain and joy, while a tingling stole down into his fingertips, and his breath came hard and fast. The sentences of this man were to Jurgis like the crashing of thunder in his soul. A flood of emotions surged up in him, all his old hopes and longings, his old griefs and rages and despairs. All that he had ever felt in his whole life seemed to come back to him at once, and with one new emotion, hardly to be described. That he should have suffered such oppressions and such horrors was bad enough, but that he should have been crushed and beaten by them, that he should have submitted and forgotten and lived in peace—ah, truly that was a thing not to be put into words, a thing not to be borne by a human creature, a thing of terror and madness. "What," asked the prophet, "is the murder of them that kill the body to the murder of them that kill the soul?" And Jurgis was a man whose soul had been murdered, who had ceased to hope and to struggle, who had made terms with degradation and despair. And now, suddenly, in one awful convulsion, the black and hideous fact was made plain to him. There was a falling in all of the pillars of his soul. The sky seemed to split above him. He stood there with his clenched hands upraised, his eyes bloodshot, and the veins standing out purple in his face, roaring in the voice of a wild beast, frantic, incoherent, maniacal. And when he could shout no more, he still stood there, gasping, and whispering hoarsely to himself, "By God! By God! By God!" End of chapter 28.